Alexander the Great, as his epithet suggests, is by far the most famous Alexander of all time. But he was not the first, nor the last, important Alexander of the Greek world. In fact, he was the third Macedonian king with that name. But today I would like to shine a light on a different Alexander. Alexander I of Epirus, who reshaped Molossia and formed the first united Epirote state. So while his famous nephew built a massive empire that shattered, Alexander of Epirus built one that lasted. In the last video, we talked about the early kings of Molossia, up until the reign of King Arybbas, who married his niece, Troas, and was the son of King Alcetas I. In 357 BC, Arybbas married off his other niece, Olympias, to Philip II of Macedonia to secure a military alliance against the growing threat of the Illyrians to the north. At the time of this alliance, Philip was only 2 years into his reign, so while he had brought Macedonia back from the brink of destruction, Molossia and Macedonia were more or less equals. But Philip was one of those 1 in a million rulers, who, within his lifetime, managed to exponentially grow the power of his realm, from the brink of destruction to a world power by the time of his death. So while Macedonia prospered under Philip II early in to this marriage alliance, Molossia remained stagnant under Arybbas. With Macedonia now eclipsing Molossia in power, Philip felt the need to reconsider the conditions of his alliance with the Molossian king. He wanted to make Arybbas the junior partner in their alliance, little better than a vassal rather than a peer. All Arybbas could do was protest, but in the late 350s BC, Philip militarily intervened in a growingly disloyal Molossia, incorporating the eastern provinces of Orestes and Parouea in Macedonia, as well as bringing the king's nephew, Alexander, to the Macedonian court as a hostage, who, for now, we will call Alexander the Molossian, to distinguish him from his nephew, a young Alexander the Great. Alexander the Molossian was not just any hostage, however. Rather than just ensuring the loyalty of Arybbas due to familial ties, he also had a claim to the Molossian throne. This was because his father, King Neoptolemus I, was the chosen heir of his grandfather, Alcetas I. This meant that Philip now had a potential claimant in his pocket whose legitimacy was perhaps even higher than that of the current sitting monarch, which only further encouraged Arybbas to remain loyal and accepting of Macedonian hegemony as to not be replaced. At this time, Philip was planning a massive campaign in Asia Minor against the Achaemenid Empire, which necessitated the loyalty of Epirus, which essentially acted as Macedonia's backdoor against the Illyrians and other northern barbarians. Even if Molossia remained neutral and weak, it could be exploited by the barbarians to cause damage within the Macedonian heartland. This meant that the Molossian king needed to be loyal to Philip as well as strong, but as has already been proven, that king could not be Arybbas. At the Macedonian court at Pella, Philip groomed Alexander the Molossian for future rule over his uncle's realm by educating him in the Macedonian style, with a focus on personal athleticism, competitiveness, and military and political skills as a whole. Alexander proved to be a good student, and his loyalty to his mentor, Philip II, was secured. There are also some ancient sources which claim that Philip groomed Alexander romantically as well, chiefly Justin in his epitome. but I think that this is a fabrication, largely because Justin was very anti-Philip. He calls Philip villainous, who was trying to depose his uncle-in-law, Arybbas, by turning his brother-in-law, Alexander, into a catamite first and then a king. But this romantic relationship is not supported anywhere else. But whatever the case, due to his Macedonian education, personal claim to the Molossian throne, and most importantly, the backing of the strongest power in the Greek world, Alexander the Molossian remained loyal to Philip II for his entire life, giving him both strength and an actual aptitude for monarchical rule. So, when his time came, Philip, at the head of his reformed and vastly superior army, swept Arybbas from his throne. Now, I have this event dated as occurring in 349 BC, but this is less widely supported than the traditional date of 342 BC. I find 349 to be more compelling due to the chronology of achievements of Alexander. I only point out the alternative here if you want to do your own reading on the subject. In any case, Alexander the Molossian became Alexander I of Epirus, and his uncle, Arybbas, now deposed, fled to Athens, which was a historic ally of the Aeacid monarchy, dating back to the reign of King Tharops in the Peloponnesian War. But importantly, this does not mean that the Athenians did this purely out of goodwill and tradition. The Athenians were staunch opponents of Philip's Macedonian expansion, and having an exiled foreign king under their control meant that they could threaten the return of that king. So if the day came that the Athenians invaded Molossia, they could easily justify it by calling it a liberation and a restoration of a wrongfully exiled king who would now remain loyal to Athens. But this restoration of Arybbas would never come, and the king faded into obscurity and eventually died. Back in Molossia, however, Philip II handed the newly installed Alexander I some of the eastern territory taken by Philip from Arybbas. But this small growth did not even begin to encapsulate the ambitions of the young 20-year-old king, whose aggressive rule was in large part influenced by his mentor Philip II and his Macedonian education as a whole. Early into his reign, he renamed his realm from Molossia, from the name of the state's principal tribe, to Epirus, which, before this point, had just described a geographical location. This was a way for him to signal his ambitions on being the king over all three major tribes of Epirus: the Molossians, Thesprotians, and Chaonians. In 342 BC, Philip II campaigned in Cassiopeia and, after laying waste to the land, transferred it as well as slaves to Alexander I, who accepted them despite being Epirotes themselves. This is one of the reasons why I date the start of Alexander's reign to 349 BC, because it gives the king time to cement his control and influence over his realm before incorporating more territory. The Molossians had exiled their own kings before, such as King Alcetas I, in the recent past, and the deposing of Arybbas in favor of a young king loyal to the Macedonians created a delicate political situation. The heavy-handed destruction and enslaving of fellow Epirotes in Cassiopeia, less than a year into the reign of Alexander, would have been enough to cause massive unrest within Epirus, making the region more of a liability to Philip rather than an asset. On the other hand, if Alexander began his reign in 349 BC, it would have given him 7 years to politically maneuver and secure his grip on his kingdom before accepting the donations of Philip II in Cassiopeia. This time also gives Alexander I time to reform the Epirote army into the proven Macedonian style, and because he was backed by Philip, he had unprecedented power to use this new army, as well as diplomatic leverage against the Chaonians, who remained the only major Epirote tribe outside of the newly formed Epirote kingdom. But eventually, like the Thesprotians, they would be incorporated too. With that being said, the formation of the Epirote state and its expansion under the Aeacid monarchy does not mean that regional identities died. The Molossians especially were important and made up an important block of support that the Epirote kings had to placate lest suffer major diplomatic troubles or even be overthrown. As briefly covered in a past video, the Epirote tribes had a nested and multi-layered governmental system within each of the major tribes. This made it especially easy for the Epirotes to accept a unified Epirus, as a new layer just had to be added, totaling federal, tribal, subtribal, and local. Even some Epirote kings, such as Pyrrhus, some 40 years later, identified more with the Molossians despite ruling over all Epirote tribes. The formation of Epirus was only the first step in creating a wider regional identity. Although it took time, intertribal cooperation, sharing a common religious center at Dodona, and good, light-handed leadership. But this process of federalization stemmed from the overall ambitions of both Philip II and Alexander I. By 336 BC, 13 years into the reign of Alexander I, Philip had expanded Macedonia into the predominant power of Greece. He was still planning his campaign in Asia Minor against the Achaemenid Empire when a rift formed between Philip and his wife, Olympias. The details of this are outside the scope of this video, but suffice to say that Olympias and her son, Alexander the Great, worried about the succession after the king's death. Philip worried that when he was on campaign in Asia, Olympias may turn to her brother on the Epirote throne for support. So Philip needed to ensure the loyalty of Alexander I to him rather than to his own sister and nephew. This solution, so common with Philip, was marriage, in this case of his daughter by Olympias, who was Alexander the Great's only full sister, Cleopatra, who would marry her uncle, King Alexander I, making it a second time in Aeacid history where uncle married niece. Again, gross. But during this wedding, Philip was assassinated by Pausanias of Orestes, securing the ascension of Alexander the Great. Now devoid of his mentor, Alexander I of Epirus now had to deal with Macedonia under Alexander III of Macedonia, who would become Alexander the Great. Side note, it is extremely annoying that there are two allied kings named Alexander at the same time. It's some real Vladimir kind of thing, but back to Epirus. Alexander I's aggression in large part came from wanting to impress Philip, but now it came from competition with his nephew, who immediately started winning battles in the Balkans, only to go on in 334 BC to fulfill his father's plans to invade the Achaemenid Empire. But while Alexander the Great looked east to Asia, Alexander I looked west to Italy. And in the same year, he accepted a plea for aid from Taras, a major Greek city in Magna Graecia, who were struggling against their barbarian neighbors. Both Alexanders would never return. One died in glory, forever being known as the Great, and the other died in a river. But looking back at Alexander's reign in Epirus, he laid the groundwork for later Epirote kings, such as Pyrrhus, to be as successful as they were, and created a base of support for his sister Olympias during the wars of the Diadochi. And while yes, he had the backing of the most powerful state in the Greek world, he had the ambition to announce his claims and the ability to carry it out, not just militarily, but also politically. So, I would make the argument that Alexander I was actually a better king when compared to his more famous nephew. He ensured the expansion and stability of the state built by his predecessors, while Alexander the Great may have won land through military might, but his death only created a chaotic frenzy where the empire of his father tore itself apart. Alexander the Great was an effective general, but Alexander I was an effective ruler, and he would probably be more well known today if his Italian campaign was more successful.